Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. I'm gonna resist the urge to do the classic fun guy joke in the intro here because honestly, this commander that we're gonna discuss today just doesn't leave much room for dad jokes. Slimefoot the Stowaway, an adorable little menace of battlefields. 3 mana, 2/3, 4 mana to make a sapling token, and whenever our little fellas perish, Slimefoot pings each opponent for 1, and we gain 1. Slimefoot is an impressive little nuisance. Whenever a commander has an activated ability that costs generic mana, you always gotta sit up and take notice. His EDHREC page is full of other fungus and thallid creatures, with a special emphasis on aristocratic death triggers that turn our silly saplings into deadly spores. Let's get going. We'll snag Slimefoot's average deck list from EDHREC's average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall price of the deck. I think Slimefoot's reputation as an adorable little guy in the lore has earned him a lot of goodwill, and honestly, so has the bright, colorful pallor of all of his favorite friends. Make no mistake though, this is one deadly deck. Like, yeah, the character in the lore is mega cute and fun, and the artwork is enjoyable and vivid, but do not be fooled, y'all. Slimefoot is harboring more damage than a clicker from The Last of Us. The damage output here is unreal. Like many classic real-world forest fungi, one wrong step and they'll mess you up. Whenever you spy a bunch of sacrifice outlets in a deck list, that should definitely clue you in about what the deck is capable of. And you know what? Speaking of which, before we make any changes, we ought to get to know Slimefoot's signature spells. And I think we should start with the very heaviest haymakers, namely Slimefoot's combo potential. With a token doubler, one activation of Slimefoot's ability produces 2 sapling tokens, and with an Ashnod's Altar, 2 sapling tokens will trade in for 4 mana to activate that ability again, pinging enemies on the way all the way to 0. That is gnarly. Or here's another big one in this deck. Spore Mound makes a sapling whenever we get a land in play, and Life and Limb turns all lands into saps and all saps into lands. Notably, neither of those abilities is a May trigger, so it'll go unstoppably infinite unless you can halt it somehow, say with one of the many sacrifice outlets that the deck contains. Infinite creatures, sack for infinite Slimefoot pings, we know the drill. We're not quite at the Gave Guru of Spores level of comboing out with everything in sight, but Slimefoot has some awesome cards that the deck definitely wants to run anyways because they're just really good with this strategy, and it just so happens that if he gets them in play together, it'll end the game on the spot. That's not the only thing this commander is up to, though. In fact, a lot of the rest of his strategy is quite neat, using silly spore counters from Thallid-style cards that slowly accumulate more and more to eventually cash in for more sapling tokens. These can be quite slow, although proliferate effects help quite a bit. And several of these Thallid creatures also have extra abilities with our sapling tokens, so they can also function as excellent sacrifice outlets to again trigger Slimefoot's damage ability. Utopia Mycon makes mana out of our saplings, for example, and we know how powerful sacking creatures for mana can be. Plenty of famous token makers take up the charge here too, like Tendershoot Dryad, to help the token train keep chugging along. With enough bodies, our opponents will either die to combat damage or to a ton of commander pings. Oh, and speaking of pings, there are so many death trigger effects in this deck too, to double up on the damage and make our enemies really regret ever messing with our stuff. So, armed with that knowledge, how are we going to make changes? There's not a whole lot to change. I really like the place that this average deck list is starting from. It's powerful, but also has a verve and a silliness to it that I really enjoy and that I think opponents will enjoy too. It rides both of those lines extremely well. We'll also have a budget version of this deck list at the end of the video, so stick around and let's see what we can tweak to improve this deck just a little bit more. I only have a few swaps to make, and to start, I gotta interrogate this Vraska here. An unrepeatable sacrifice outlet to draw a card? A sorcery speed removal effect that only works on a single low mana permanent? An ultimate that, well, okay, admittedly, that ultimate is actually very cool, but it's 9 loyalty to get there. Sorry, Vraska, but this is a pretty easy cut for me. I also want to take stock of our Saproling generator cards. We've got some very playful options in this deck, from spore counter creatures to interesting spells to other interesting creatures making Saprolings, and even some auras that pump out 1/1 tokens every single turn. So with that in mind, I gotta say, this Druidic Satchel leaves a lot to be desired. 4 mana to try and make a 1/1, but it's not quite reliable. If we flip a land, it goes into play, and I suppose that's nice, but if it's a spell, we just gain 2 life? This is a cute card, but I know we can do better. I'd much rather play a card that is dedicated and really good at one thing over a card that's kind of middling at 2 different things. So in fact, let's do that. If we want mana ramp spells, I can't help but notice that this deck isn't running Sakura Tribe Elder, and I find that odd. I think we could use it. The deck is already playing Rampant Growth, after all. We know we like 2 mana ramp effects in this deck, especially since our commander is 3 mana and a 2 mana ramp spell will fit right in under that on the mana curve. But unlike Rampant Growth and all of those other 2 mana spells, Sakura Tribe Elder can also trigger one of our many Poison Tip Archer effects if we happen to draw it later in the game. I suppose we could swap things straight across, take out the Rampant Growth and put in the Sakura Tribe Elder, but I'd rather have both. I'd love to fill an additional mana advantage slot with this reliable ramp creature that also has some nice potential incidental upside. Now that fulfilled a ramp slot, but let's also crack our knuckles and get some more Saproling generation in here too. Saproling Burst needs to be in this deck yesterday. I was tempted to save this card as my final inclusion because I think it's the coolest thing to build up to, but no, I can't help it. This card is so awesome in Slimefoot. This card enters with 7 fading counters on it, which is a lot like Vanishing. On our upkeep, we remove 1 counter, but if we can't remove a counter from a permanent with fading, it goes away. In the meantime, though, we can remove the counters manually to create a very unusual Saproling token, one that isn't a measly 1/1, but rather has a power and toughness equal to the number of fading counters left on this very enchantment. So if we remove 1 counter, we'll make a 6/6 Saproling. If we remove 2, we'll get 2 5/5s. And over time, those would dwindle in size because, you know, the counters get removed on our upkeep. But the thing is, we're not here to just make 2 5/5s. We're here to make 7 0/0 Saprolings. Yoink all the counters off of this thing and make 7 bodies that will instantly crunch and trigger Slimefoot for a bunch of damage. Or maybe we have an Anthem card in play, or we can play around with making just enough of the Saprolings to Skull Clamp a few of them, or do whatever your heart desires. This is manipulatable Saproling production, and it's even a permanent that we can get back from the graveyard more easily than we can get back a spell from the graveyard. This card is an ace in the hole for Slimefoot. Get it in here. I want to now take a brief pause for the lands in this deck, and largely the mana base is in really good shape. The deck is low enough to the ground and contains a good chunk of ramp, so I like the land count and I generally appreciate all of the color fixing too. I'll just make a few small tweaks. Haunted Mire and Jungle Hollow are just okay. If we're going to have tapped lands anyway, I think we should cut these and replace them instead with Path of Ancestry and Myriad Landscape. Landscape could trigger some nice landfall stuff while also ramping us, which is pretty cool, and Path of Ancestry is really awesome here. This deck has so many fungus creatures in it. We'll get so many scry triggers off of this, and I think that's better upside than the Jungle Hollow giving us just 1 life. Okay, just 2 more swaps, and this time my eyes are on the suite of removal spells. Golgari is no stranger to excellent removal, but this Eaten Alive card gives me pause. It could be just 1 mana to exile something, and that sounds awesome, but it does need a creature to sacrifice, and more importantly, its sorcery speed. Sacking a creature is this deck's whole MO, so that's probably okay, but I still hesitate with removal spells that require us to have a board state in order to be effective. Most of the time when we're in need of pinpoint removal, it's because we're behind and we need to claw back into a game. And also, we often need pinpoint removal at instant speed, not at sorcery speed, to stop people from doing the types of bonkers powerful stuff that our commander is capable of, for example. I actually think that our pinpoint removal is already pretty okay, so I hope it's alright to cut this one and exchange it for a standout Golgari spell, and that's Culling Ritual. Wipe out all the small stuff and get mana back in exchange for it. This is what Vraska from earlier thought she was serving. I've genuinely seen Culling Rituals make over 50 mana, which Slimefoot would be really keen to use to make a ton of tokens. The only problem, of course, is that this card kills off our Saprolings. Except, oh wait, that's not a problem at all. Slimefoot loves it when Saprolings die. Let's get the Culling in here. And finally, our card draw. Generally, it's not bad, though this deck can't rely upon the usual green spells that would draw cards based off of the power of our creatures, so we have a lot of other types of card draw instead, including at least one that feels very lackluster to me. Thallid Soothsayer is a sacrifice outlet, but it costs mana to use it. Half of our other sacrifice outlets are giving us mana to sacrifice creatures. I just think this one is slow, so I'm chopping him, and to replace it, I'm taking inspiration from one of the best cards in the entire deck. Did y'all notice how Slimefoot doesn't say our opponents lose life? He says our opponents take damage. So the Snake Umbra in the average deck list, which draws a card every time the enchanted creature deals damage, will draw us a card for each opponent that Slimefoot pings when our stuff dies. That is awesome, and in fact it's so awesome that I have to get its buddy into this deck list too, the 1-mana Keen Sense. This is a hugely potent draw engine. In a 4-player game, 1 Saproling dying means we draw 3 cards. And thankfully, these are May abilities, so we're not ever forced to deck ourselves out. Absolute gold. That's it for the official swaps, but before we get to the budget build, let's pause for some honorable mentions. If you're building this deck more lavishly, how might that go down? Well, the deck really shifts in its identity as things get more pricey. Some of the Thallid-style creatures start to lose their luster, for instance. We like the ones that have really cool sacrifice abilities, but a few of the other Spore Counter Gatherers begin to feel a little too slow, as do a few of the other helper cards in the deck. They're fun cards for sure, but with a higher budget, Slimefoot decks tend to opt for some pretty gnarly cards instead. Death triggers like Pitiless Plunderer and Dictative Erebus really take hold, and if you need more card draw, then Species Specialist could get you a lot of cards when you start to pick off all of those Saprolings. Mana production is probably the primary focus, though. Cards that turn our creatures or our creature count into mana production can exponentially accelerate the number of tokens that Slimefoot will generate. Seedborn Muse in particular is notable to activate Slimefoot multiple times per round. Admittedly, these higher budget cards lose a lot of the flavor and identity that some of those Spore Counters had with their theming, which some players may not enjoy because it can feel a little more, quote, good stuffy. But as the deck's budget changes, more reliable and more heavy mana production helps put Slimefoot's own activated ability as a greater focus of the overall strategy. And some other classics emerge here too, like more advanced removal and protection, and a personal favorite, the original Namada, which really has a lot of fun with Saproling tokens. Although, I gotta admit, the math does make my brain start to hurt a little. Oh, and the lands get really fun too, of course. Lots of death can be contained in this mana base, which seems very fitting for a deck full of mushroom people. But that'll do it for this version of the deck. You can find this list in the description down below with the cuts in the maybe board. But we're not done yet. I feel like I say this in every other video, but it's especially the case here. Very commonly, when we see a big price tag on a deck, you can usually trace that price tag back to just a small group of culprit cards. And that is so the case for this list. This is such a good example of that phenomenon. I'm only going to cut 5 cards from this deck list, and the price is going to drop so fast that you better watch out, because it might hurt somebody. Doubling Season. This average deck contains a Doubling Season and a Parallel Lives. If you're dedicated to the combo that these have with Slimefoot and with Ashnod's Altar, then yes, these might be very important for your deck, but I get the sense that this entire deck is not solely built just around the combo. Otherwise, this deck would have a lot more tutors to search out those individual combo pieces, you know? Anyway, goodbye to those two, and goodbye also to Tendershoot Dryad, as well as the next 2 most expensive cards, these 2 lands. Good cards, great cards, really, but if you don't got them, that's totally okay. Those lands are really easy to swap out on a budget. Let's just get back those 2 lands that were chopped earlier. Perfectly respectable replacements, especially if we don't have the pricier lands on hand. As for the non-land cards, what will we do to replace those? Well, one of the cards we lost was a Saproling Producer, so I'd like to replace that one first, and I'm going to opt for Spontaneous Generation, a 4-mana sorcery that gives us Saprolings for each card in our hand. This one is swingy. It might be the best card in the deck, or it might be the worst. With all the Keen Sense, Snake Umbra draw that we're capable of, we could definitely get one hefty grip. But with all the mana we're making and the stuff that we're throwing onto the battlefield, we could also end up with like nothing in hand too. This card is inconsistent, which is why I didn't put it into the first version of the list. But I think a risky card is fun to play around with, and the times that this card produces a huge swing will be very memorable indeed. So I think it's worth it to try out here. Speaking of cards in hand, I always love to spruce up the card draw too, and sacrifice-based draw is excellent here, so Plumb the Forbidden would be my next recommendation. Need a sacrifice outlet? Check. Need to refill the hand? Also check. This thing is so dang flexible and versatile. I use this card in my own token deck, and it's an all-star there, and that deck doesn't even care about the death triggers. I'm just using it to refill my hand in case of a board wipe. It's awesome in that deck, but in this deck, it's even better. And finally, a bit of a left field choice, I think Jaheira is worth a look for budget Slimefoot players. This is a Cryptolith Rite, but without the $11 price tag. Turn the tokens into mana dorks so that saprolings beget more saprolings. It's a little silly, but if this snowball is allowed to pick up any momentum at all, it really can get out of control. Those are the 5 most expensive card swaps in the deck, but if you want to go one more, Ashnod's Altar is the next most pricey card in the list. This card was crucially part of the infinite combos with those token doubling cards, but of course those token doublers were cut from the budget version. I think Ashnod's Altar is still amazing enough to play even without any combos, but in the event that cutting the token doublers also makes you wish to avoid the altar, the next card on my list of things to check out is Evolution Sage. We have a lot of spore counters here that could use a little extra proliferation after all. I'll make a note here that yes, I ultimately prefer Evolution Sage to the infamous Thelon of Havenwood, a well-known spore counter appreciator. Thelon is cute, but the buff is unwieldy to me, and honestly that activated ability is so much less consistent. I enjoy the simplicity of Evolution Sage ticking up those spore counters just through our natural game plan and throwing off all of our opponent's math, especially if Life and Limb is in play, turning all of our tokens into yet more landfall triggers. Again, I'm keeping the Ashnod's Altar in the official budget list, but if you're avoiding that one, this is just some fun food for thought. And okay, if you actually really want to be a little silly, remember how I made such a big deal out of Slimefoot dealing damage instead of doing life loss? Well, here's one more mention. Giving this commander Infect could be yet another silly option if you really want to dig in and put the slime in Slimefoot. And that'll do it. Only 5 cards different, but with 2/3 of the cost lopped off the price tag. You can find a link to both deck lists in the description below, with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed stowing away with Slimefoot, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make so that your fellow Golgari players can cause even more truffle, make sure you leave those suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.